Good morning. It's Thursday, the 27th of August, 2020. Welcome back to the best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. My name is Pete Fairbairn. I'm your host, and as always, I'm joined by one of Australia's top sports journos. Today, Beth Newman joins me. How are you, Beth?
I'm great. How are you going, Pete?
I'm going really well. There's lots happening in the world of sport. It would be remiss after having Phil Lutton on the show yesterday from Townsville talking about the big fight up there. It'd be remiss not to acknowledge a massive win for Tim Zhu over Jeff Horn in Townsville last night. The fight stopped after the 8th round. Pretty comprehensive victory for Tim Zhu. That was being streamed live into the US, so we look forward to seeing who he's managing to find himself in the ring with next, but pretty exciting future for him. However, we're going to start today by talking about a little bit of rugby union and a pretty huge story from Jessica Halloran in the Australian this morning. She's spoken to Wallabies captain Michael Hooper, who's announced that he's taking up the option of a sabbatical with Japanese top league team Toyota Verblitz in 2021. He'll join that club in January next year for a 6-month stint. Of course, he remains eligible to play for Australia during that time due to the sheer number of test matches he's played and the Giddo law that's currently in place. We know he's locked up with Australian rugby until the 2023 World Cup. What he's done there is taken advantage of a sabbatical option which the Rugby Union Players Association secured in their pay negotiations earlier this year when COVID hit. Beth, you've obviously worked really closely in the sport for a number of years. How important is it for Michael Hooper to get this opportunity to take a sabbatical? But also, looking at the New South Wales Waratahs, his provincial team, we know Rob Simmons is leaving to London Irish. We know that Ned Hannigan is going to Japan as well. There's not a lot of experience in that Waratahs team already. Are they going to be competitive in 2021?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting sort of balance when you're talking about these sabbaticals. Yes, obviously Michael Hooper absolutely deserves it. On one hand, because of the workload, as you've mentioned, how much footy he's played over the last 5 years, but also because, at the start of this COVID period, Australia's highest earners in rugby were taking 80% pay cuts, which is where this sabbatical clause kind of came from for guys like Michael Hooper, Dane Haylett-Petty, Matt Tamua, Tavita Kurandrani, because they were making the biggest financial sacrifices of anybody in the sport in Australia. So he's being rewarded in one sense for that. On field, it's going to be tough for the Waratahs, absolutely. As you mentioned, a few of their biggest names and their cap test players are going overseas next year. But I think on the flip side, we've seen this year that the Waratahs have a huge upside in their younger players, and they will lose that leadership, and that there'll be a void there, obviously. But guys like Will Harrison, even if you look at the back row, Lockie Swinton, Will Harris at number 8, even Carlo Tizzano, who's coming through, who we haven't really seen a lot of him this year. He's been released to play club footy in the last few weeks, but he's a really exciting prospect as well. So I think you have to look at it as a way, that they can unearth a little bit more of that youth. And Rob Penny, the Waratahs coach, has been really committed to backing his young players, and it's paid off for the most part. So if you go into 2021 knowing that that's going to be the scenario, rather than looking at what do the Waratahs look like without Michael Hooper, it's, who can fill that void, who's going to step up and take charge. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. Probably the flow on from that, though, is, without Michael Hooper, without potentially some of those names I mentioned before, Matt Tamua, Dane Haylett-Petty, some of Australia's biggest names are all looking to that, 6-month sabbatical in Japan because of the timing and because of the, the greater kind of cash involved, and also the slightly lessened workload in Japan. So it'll be interesting to see what Super Rugby AU or, what the competition looks like, and whether some of the, having some of the most recognisable names in the game playing in Japan, even just for Super Rugby, what that has for the kind of recognition and the familiarity of the competition, more broadly.
Yeah, Hooper's going to join Toyota Verblitz, where he'll be alongside former All Blacks captain Kieran Reid and former All Blacks coach Steve Hansen. Never thought we'd see the day, but perhaps some of their success and some of their wisdom will be imparted upon him as well. We know Michael Hooper remains at this point very much a key component of the Wallabies 2023 Rugby World Cup planning. Staying with rugby for our second story today, and it comes from the other side of the world with Daniel Schofield in the Telegraph. He's talking about some major doubts with World Rugby's ability to enact reform and to set up a global calendar before the 2023 Rugby World Cup. I feel like it's something we've been talking about for at least a decade, trying to find a way for the different hemispheres to work together to come up with a calendar, a window for Test rugby, and then a window for their provincial competitions. Then you've got obviously the politics added in the Northern Hemisphere, where you have the Premiership Rugby and Top 14 competitions, which are run independent of the governing bodies in those countries as well. It's a bit of a disaster all over again. There's the next formal meeting is between all the main stakeholders on September 7. That's more than 2 months since the last meeting, which ended fractiously with the president of French Rugby threatening legal action. I tell you what, Beth, this is just it's the same story repeated verbatim that we've seen for such a number of years. Are we ever going to see a global rugby calendar?
I'm not sure is probably the short answer, because, as you said, it's kind of a bit of a broken record, isn't it? The last, 5-10 years, it feels like we're just going round and round in circles. And it's just, I think particularly looking from a Southern Hemisphere perspective, when you look at, the club power in the North is really frustrating, I think, when you see the power that the top 14 and the Premiership have. I mean, these competitions run something like, 8 or 9 months of the year. They're incredibly long. It's incredibly difficult to find a window that suits everybody, but because they have such power, and the Northern Hemisphere, as test nations also wield such financial power and such influence over world rugby, it's, very difficult to find a balance in that. And I think, ideally, down here, it's been really clear that, the Sanzar nations really just want to be able to have their kind of domestic competitions or their localized competitions being able to play unbroken, which we've finally gotten to after years and years of negotiating around that June test window and being able to push that back. But it just doesn't make sense to be chopping and changing in and out of club rugby and test rugby. And I think the problem is that when you have, club competitions that are so powerful, they think they have the rights to players. It makes it tricky for clubs for the best players to be able to play, and for the test nations to be able to, wield some sort of power. And it's frustrating to see, because it just makes it difficult in countries where it's already hard for rugby to gain traction, to actually have that unbroken run of test matches, which is what, particularly from an Australian perspective, the sport needs to be able to lift its profile. Because Super Rugby is, great on one level, but you need to have a consistent run of Wallabies test matches, whether that's here or in the Northern Hemisphere, and that's, so important for the appetite of the game, I think.
Yeah, well said. And I think, you look at the British and Irish Lions tour of South Africa next year. There's the Premiership final is going to be played just a week before the first match on that tour, which is just ridiculous to look at. And unions not working together with so many different, different factors at play. And, we've obviously got the status quo with Bill Beaumont, being re-elected as World Rugby head. And you can't help but wonder whether Augustine Pichot, the revolutionary rival for that role, would have been able to maybe oversee something different. Our third story this morning, we turn to the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, and Dean Ritchie written a really good article about the NRL's ferocious battle to secure fourth place and avoid finals oblivion. We know that the top 8 appears pretty much wrapped up in the NRL, and really 7th place South Sydney and 8th place Cronulla would really have to drop the bundle from here to not play finals this year. We know the top 3 looks pretty assured, with Penrith, Melbourne and Parramatta seemingly locked in there as well. But it's the battle for 4th place that's really quite fascinating, because of course that comes with a double chance come finals. You've got Sydney Roosters on 20 points, you've got Canberra on 20 points, you've got Newcastle Knights on 19 points. The Roosters play the teams running 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th over the final 4 weeks, which will be wonderful theatre. You've got Ricky Stewart, the Canberra coach, saying his team's defence isn't good enough to win the big end of season games. You've got the Rabbitohs having not beaten any team above them on the table. Newcastle were probably the easiest run home, playing the Warriors, St George and the Gold Coast. How important is it to finish in the top 4, Beth, and who do you think is going to end up there?
Well, yeah, no one has won the premiership outside of that top 4 in the NRL, I think, since 1995. So it's incredibly important, and especially since the switch to the different final system, where you have the top 4 having the double chance and a guaranteed home final in week 2, even if you do lose in week 1. You cannot overstate how important it is to get into that top bracket, because if you have a bad game, you get that second chance and you have the home advantage to try and catapult yourself into, the third and fourth weeks. It's going to be a really interesting battle. I think the NRL is always fascinating, I think, to watch. It's always so close. And, even though you do have those kind of top three teams that seem pretty, solidified now, the rest of that top 8 is still to be decided. And, it's exciting when you have a team like the Roosters fighting for a spot in that top 4 and, and having to play, as you said, all those teams that they're going to have to compete with in finals as well. And it's going to be a really interesting battle these last few weeks to see who comes up on top. And because of, all the challenges that the teams have faced this year, it's going to be a real, kind of battle of attrition, I think. And, it's kind of finals every week, even before you get to the finals, and winning that 4th spot, could make or break, a team season, but also, maybe the fortunes of backroom staff and admin staff that we've seen. It's such a brutal game, and any win can really, change your fortunes dramatically.
Yeah, I think a smoky for mine would be the Knights. They've got that softish run home. And I think that would really turn the competition on its head, because even if they were to secure a top 4 spot, I can't see the Knights challenging for the premiership. Whereas if the Roosters or Raiders were to get in there, I think they could be a threat. So we'll continue to watch that one. Our penultimate story today comes from Dean Bilton at abc.com.au. He's had a really good look at the All-Australian team in the AFL competition. And specifically at the AFL's best defenders, and how difficult it's going to be to pick 6 defenders in that All-Australian team. They come in so many different shapes and sizes. We've got the key defenders, we've got the rotating defenders, and we've got the small defenders as well. He's got a long list here: Harris Andrews, Jacob Wiedering, Sam Doherty, Liam Jones, Darcy Moore, Braden Maynard, Adam Saad, Jordan Ridley. I could go on. A long list of players who you could absolutely argue the case, not just for inclusion in the All-Australian 40 squad, but in the 22. In general, Beth, how tough is it going to be to pick an All-Australian team this year? Less matches than a standard season. Who are the locks so far, including in defence?
Yeah, as you said, it's kind of been such a topsy-turvy season for the AFL. Every week it seems almost impossible to pick the winners. But there have been some guys that have stood out, I think. And it's been kind of exciting, I think, to see some kind of key position players step up, I think, with the shorter quarters and, all the things that have gone on. It seems like there's a little bit more of a move back to some of that more traditional one-on-one style footy a little bit. And guys like Tom Hawkins has been, phenomenal to watch this season, even Charlie Dixon. And then from a defence point of view, Harris Andrews is just, it's almost, I'm always been a fan of defence myself, and it's exciting to watch key defenders really have that one-on-one battle with some of the key forwards in the competition. And then you look kind of probably more to the midfield, and a guy like Nick Natanui in the ruck. It's been so exciting to watch him play and basically, be back to some of his best footy this year. It's awesome to see. I think some of those guys have really stood up. And then, you've got guys like Lachie Neale, who's been really good. And even, from a Melbourne perspective, a Christian Petrarca might be a bit of a smoky. He's really improved this year. There's been some really exciting ones, but, I think it'll be, if you've got to be the most consistent player in a consistent team, right? And that's where teams have probably fallen down this season. And it'll be interesting to see, who kind of can keep this run of form going, after months and months of being away from home and being on the road, particularly for those Victorian teams that haven't, been back to Melbourne for, a couple of months now.
Yeah, very well said. I think Harris Andrews is undoubtedly the top key defender in the competition now. Our final story today comes from TV Black Box and Kevin Perry, an unusual source perhaps for the show, but extremely relevant. He talks about the ABC programming decision, which is set to hit the ALeague Grand Final ratings this Sunday night. Of course, the 2 semi-finals played last night, Melbourne City and Sydney FC, both winning their matches 2-0, and the top 2 teams on the table when the season finished will contest the grand final. If you don't have Fox Sports or you don't have KO, you're going to be watching this one on delay, and you're going to have to know where to look for it, Beth, because it's going to be broadcast on ABC's secondary channel, ABC Me. Obviously, that means it's pretty unlikely to attract many casual observers of the code who are just flicking through. Of course, the broadcast agreement with Fox Sports prevents that match from being live, so it's going to be 2 hours delayed. It won't be in high definition either. The figures have been pretty disappointing for the A-League from a ratings perspective since it restarted. And I wonder, Beth, how can that competition ever capture hearts and minds when a lot of people either won't know it's on or can't watch it live?
It's one of those big debates, isn't it? Having spent a lot of time in rugby, it's that, you know, whenever a broadcast deal comes up, it's always that debate of if you don't have something on free to wear and you don't have something live on free to wear and able, like with the ability for people to be able to access it, as you say, as a casual fan, how much are you losing from that? And it's a huge portion of sports fans and of just people in general. I know that, you know, if you're flicking through the TV, you know, you might stumble on a footy game and it's always going to be AFL or NRL pretty much, and maybe a little bit of netball. But, you know, you need to have that presence, especially for, I mean, maybe for regular season games, it's tough because there are a lot of them and you've got to fit things in. But for the grand final, you'd think, you know, the ABC would be able to find a slot, even on delay, on their main channel. But, you know, on the flip side, maybe it's an indictment that they don't think they're going to get enough people watching it on their main channel, so they have to shift it. So that's an indictment on probably the product of the A-League as well, and probably, you know, reflect some of the difficulties that football faces in Australia as well. It's such a tough sort of tough debate, and now that we have this sort of, you know, secondary channel versus main channel, you see it happen a lot with sport. We've seen the discussion, I think, around some women's cricket matches being you know, put onto 9Gem and all that sort of thing. So it's a really tough thing, because, you know, as TV stations have to make decisions based on ratings, but, you know, it can be a really, you know, missed opportunity when your biggest game of the year, albeit on delay, but on delay because it has to be on delay as part of the broadcast agreement. So that's something you can't shift. But to have it kind of, you know, parked on a secondary channel, you kind of go, what's the point a little bit, you know, because people, as you say, really have to be dedicated to watching that game and knowing it's on and trying to find it. And when you have things shifting channels, you know, sometimes that can turn people off as well. If you just know something's going to be on Channel 10 every weekend or ABC every weekend, you know where to look for it, and having to work hard for it is a little bit too much. And then, you know, when it is on, to not have it in high definition, I think is pretty bad as well. It's, you know, sport in standard definition these days, you know, there's no excuse really for having it not in high definition. I think it's such a better product for people to watch, and it just, you know, reflects it. You know, if it's not being shown in high definition, it really reflects it that they don't really see the value in it. And so it's on the secondary channel, not in high definition. And, you know, you really question a little bit what's the point of showing it and having it if you're not going to really broadcast it and showcase it a little bit more.
Yeah, roughly 400,000 watched the 2019 A-League Grand Final between Sydney FC and Perth Glory. We know, of course, this season has been delayed and it's finishing later than usual, right in the heart of things really heating up in the AFL and NRL. But all those factors that you just spelled out there, I think they'll be lucky to get half that amount watching it this year, which is not a good sign for a competition that is really struggling to capture hearts and minds. And I'll be honest, I think delayed sport is essentially redundant in 2020. When we want to follow social feeds while we're watching, we want to engage with experts on Twitter, and we want to see what other people are saying, and we want to be able to follow the match live. I mean, I watch a lot of English football that I've recorded, you know, that's played in the middle of the night, and I watch it first thing in the morning, and sitting down for 90 minutes, not being able to look at your phone for fear of seeing the result, and not being able to engage with the, you know, the social stream while it's happening is definitely a less enjoyable viewing experience. And for that to be happening, I would say, yeah, let's get to the point where we can just all put our hands up, whether it's A-League, whether it's Super Rugby, whatever it might be, and say to play, you know, on free-to-air television in Australia, to play a match of sport 2 hours later, you know, not live, delayed, is essentially redundant. There's no point in doing it. Beth, that's all we've got time for today. Thank you so much for jumping on the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. I always have a lot of fun having you on the show, and love hearing your insight and analysis on things.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
You've been watching or listening to the Best On Ground Weekday Kickoff. Coming up tomorrow, we have the Australians' Courtney Walsh. We'll be looking at a big weekend of AFL football and everything else happening in the world of sport. And we'll see, we might even mention a bit of Novak Djokovic with Courtney on the show. Take care. Have a great day. We'll see you later.